Oh, that's good.
Mike, how's that sound? Is that loud enough? Kevin, can you hear me? 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 You can hear me? Not great. I can move it up a little bit. Kevin, can you hear me? All right, there we go. Everybody in here heard me except Kevin. All righty. Good morning. We're going to have to get, if we're going to get finished, we need to get started. So here we go. Glad everybody's here this morning. I'm going to run through a couple of announcements. Maria White's still taking chemo. Amanda and Rylan are both got the COVID. Ladies' Bible class, Wednesday, December 14th at 10. And I don't have a note here who's teaching that, but ladies show up for that. This 14th at 10. Last the leaders' registration fees, we don't need any of that. We're looking for volunteers to help with the food teams. See Tammy Harmon. We passed out 25 Farmington Cardinal gifts, bags, bunch of gifts. Thank you for everything that you guys do. Raised over $2,000 for the Navajo Reservation. We're going to be sending $2,500 there for the necessities and all that do. Quilting ladies looking for flat sheets, solid colors that they use on their quilts. And for Christmas Day, Sunday worship service only at 10:30. No classes or any service Sunday evening. So I'll go ahead and take class on Christmas. You can start the week after. Okay, I'll take that class. You can start the week after. I'll be more than happy to take that class. Matter of fact, I'm excited about taking that class.
You can go ahead and do it online.
I can do it online. So the 25th morning service only, 10:30, no classes, and then no Sunday evening service. So remember that. Okay, as we get started, if you're new to this class, we're in Romans. We're just getting started in Romans. Matter of fact, we're in chapter 1 of Romans, verse 18 through 32. I'm going to read that real quick, and then we'll get on with our lesson. And our theme is God's wrath. And I know that sounds like a terrible thing, but we'll get into that later. Maybe. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, those who hinder the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which is known of God is manifest in them, for God manifested it unto them. For the invisible things of him, since the creation of the world, are clearly seen, being perceived through the things that are made, even his everlasting power and divinity, that they may be without excuse. Because that, knowing God, they glorified him not as God, neither gave thanks, but became vain in their reasonings, and their senseless heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God for the likeness of an image of corruptible man, and of birds, and four-footed beasts, and creeping things. Wherefore God gave them up in the lust of their hearts unto uncleanness, that their bodies should be dishonored among themselves, for that they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this cause God gave them up into vile passions. For the women changed the natural use into that which is against nature, and likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burning their lust one toward another, men with men, working unseemliness, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was due. And even as they refused to have God in their knowledge, God gave them up into a reprobate mind to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malignity, whispers, backbiters, hateful to God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, unmerciful, who, knowing the ordinance of God, that they that practice such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but also consent with them that practice them. And that's quite a list. And we're going to talk a lot about it, but Paul focuses the first part of that section of Scripture on idolatry and homosexuality, and we're going to talk about those things. But in the world we live in, I don't think it's necessarily that much different than the world that Paul lived in Rome. I've read some history of Rome, and through all of the history of Rome, there was a fall. There was a fall of Rome. And we're going to talk about that a little bit here in a little bit. So, as we start the class, the author that wrote this particular lesson was required, as a new hire to a particular job, to take a class on cultural diversity. And I don't know if anybody's looked for a job or got a job lately, but that's a thing. Cultural diversity. And these topics of discussion were alternative sexual lifestyles, homosexuality and transgender issues are all at the forefront. But the comment that the speaker made was the interesting part regarding cultural acceptance. He no longer considered mere tolerance as an acceptable approach to alternative lifestyles. He wanted his lifestyle choices to be accepted by society as legitimate, moral choices. Tolerance was no longer acceptable. So this person felt like he could choose the writer's morality for him, basically, was what he was saying. I had to accept his choices as morally acceptable without option. So as we look at the direction our culture is going, has been going for quite some time, you can see a vast change in, and we're just going to call it tolerance this morning, but you can see a vast change in society as far as tolerance towards, and this morning we're going to call it alternative lifestyles. And so those are the kind of things we're going to be speaking about. So people in the church who are leaning toward or know those accepting of ambiguous view, if not supportive of the homosexual lifestyles, there's a push to be acceptance of these alternative lifestyles. But we need to remember in Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. Let's remember that. The issue in Paul's day are similar to the issues that we're having today, especially if you consider Rome and the fall of Rome. And I don't know if anybody in here has any ideas about what that was, but they talk about that homosexuality and pedophilia were the fall of the Roman Empire. And I don't know if anybody's ever heard that or not, but they contributed to the fall of the Roman Empire. So in Paul's day, he's dealing with these two issues, these two sins, about why God's wrath is upon humankind. And that's because sin resides with humanity. Okay? Sin doesn't reside with God. Purity and everything that is pure resides with God. Humanity is where sin comes in. And so that's the separation of what Paul's talking about. Sin resides with humanity, and humanity is in rebellion against the Creator and turned its back on God. You can look at the world around you and see that the world, humanity, has turned its back on God. And that results in anger and wrath. And that anger and wrath and that separation in Romans explains the need for the gospel. Okay? So if anybody ever asks, why do we need the cross? Why do we need the gospel? It's humanity's separation from God, and the only way to come back in a relationship with God is through the gospel. Because humanity is lost and cannot save itself. And that's what humanity fails to realize at this point in our culture. Humanity does not have the ability, cannot save itself. So, we talked last week about who Paul was talking to in Rome, and predominantly a Gentile audience. And so, Paul answers the question of why the gospel is necessary, why you need the cross, by first pointing to basically how the Gentiles are living, the lack of morality in the Gentile world, the depravity, and their moral bankruptcy is just proof that the world needs saving. Okay, and the two that come to the forefront, I said earlier, are the homosexuality and idolatry. And there's a reason for that. It points to the depravity of both religion and morals. In his description of all humanity, the heart of the problem is the depravity of both religion and morals. Okay? Now, the heart of the problem, or the cause of God's anger, isn't in the sins of homosexuality and idolatry alone. It's not just those, because if you go to the end of the chapter there's a long list. Goes anything from murder to disobeying your parents or talking about your neighbor, and Jim Lehman talks about it all the time. We like to put sins on a gauge. We like to put a scale to it on a gauge.
Like, I understand some better than others.
Absolutely. And I'm going to justify my sins by exposing somebody else's sins that are way worse than mine, and that just makes me better. And the better I am, the better I like it. And that's how society works. So, so those claiming a higher moral standing, those looking down on those that commit those, what we would consider bad sins, are just as guilty as the ones participating in those bad sins. Okay? These are symptoms of the problem. Our sin, the sin of humanity, is a symptom of the problem. The problem lies in humanity rejecting God as creator. The world has rejected God, for the most part, as creator. And so idolatry rejects him as God and creator. Homosexuality rejects the nature in which he made us. And this is not talking about our physicality or whatever. That's actually talking about, Mike talks about it a lot, how nature was put in motion for a particular reason, in a particular way, to build upon each piece of nature. And so each component in nature can coexist and coexist with one another. So it rejects him as God as creator. It rejects him as God, rejects the nature that he. And this writer, one of his things is it rejects God's creative intentions, and I think that's a good descriptor of what Mike tries to get across to us when he talks about how nature is built on each end. God's creative intention. Okay, so rejection of these things, and the problem in the world is rebellion against God. And it all boils down to rebellion against God. All sins, whether we consider them big or little, we're all guilty. All are guilty. So, in order to proclaim the gospel, you have to understand both sides of God's love and God's anger towards humanity, towards the world. Because without one, you can't really understand the other. Salvation implies peril and danger. And the religious society likes to put danger as you're going to hell. That's the danger part of God's gospel. But what are we being, and we talk about salvation and saved, what are we being saved from? And that's a question we need to ask ourselves. Are we being saved from the corrupt world that we live in? Are we being saved from the actions of humanity that have grown out of this corruption of God's intention of nature? And it becomes more personal than that, okay? It becomes more personal than afraid of going to hell, and that's why I do the things that God has me to do, so I'm afraid of going to hell. And I'm not discounting that at all, because any of you that have children know that children live and act and learn differently, absolutely differently. My kids were no different. My kids, JT, I could just tell him what to do, and he would just do it. And Brandon was the opposite of whatever that is. And it took different types of threat or fear of punishment in order for them to act in a way that was the way I wanted them to behave. And that's just the way it was. And there are times, and we're going to allude to this, but I want to tell this story while it's fresh on my mind. There were times when I let them make a decision, knowing full well that what the outcome was going to be. But, as a parent, you pick your battles. They were young, both of them fairly young, and we were at T-ball or basketball or something. I don't know. We were at some sporting event, and I had a little Toyota pickup that just had a single cab. And of course, Brandon, he's the one that always had a great idea. And Brandon is, I got a great idea. Let's ride in the back. And of course, it's raining. And I knew that wasn't a great idea. There's no way that I could explain and tell them that was not a great idea. So I just let them find out for themselves that was not a great idea. Because as we started going faster, and the rain started coming down harder, and they didn't have anywhere to hide, it was just beating them to death back there. And of course, I've got a little sliding window. And they slide, they're banging on the, Dad, let us in. No, you're wet. You're not getting in my truck wet. You guys are just going to have to ride it out. And so, and I want us to remember this story, okay? Just remember the story, because we're going to get to it in the lesson. But guess what they never wanted to do again? Not one time did they ever ask me to ride in the back of the truck in the rain again. So, they can be taught. That's just what they can be taught. And they can learn of their own volition that some ideas are not the greatest ideas. Humanity has trouble with that. And so, when we separate good from evil, heaven from hell, God's will against the world's will, and God's morality against the world's morality, or what they call morality, or what they would have the others believe as morality, it's just a decisive line in the sand that separates those that have accepted God and those that have rejected God. It's just that line. And so, as we go through our study, and as we go through our life, we need to remember that there is a line. And my line may be different than your line. Humanity as a whole's line may be different than my line. But God's line is always the same. And so, God's wrath is real. It's directed at humankind, and there's no way to calm God's wrath or abate God's wrath other than the gospel. Okay, that's the only way. The gospel, that we come in a relationship with God. We're on His side of the line. That's the only way. The gospel is the only solution to the problem that the world faces now with its separation from God. Now, we look around the world and we see sinful people being prosperous. We see alternative lifestyle communities growing and being successful and all the things that this world says are good. Okay? Without what we would consider God's wrath and punishment in their lives. Okay? We need to remember that the sin in and of itself is the punishment. Okay? The sin in and of itself is what separates us from God, and separation from God is the punishment. And so the sins that we participate in, that we find what we would term pleasure, we need to remember that sin is in and of itself the punishment of God, because it separates us from our Father. It separates us from our Creator. It separates us from all that's important. Everything that's important. This life, this vapor we live here on this earth, and the pleasures and the things of it are just a dot on the grand scheme of what God has in store for His beloved bride. And so we need to remember that. Our sinful lifestyles are our punishment. God has handed us over to our sin. And as humanity, we have to live in the world that we ruin. God gave us perfection, and starting with Adam, we ruined it, and we just continued to ruin it, and it just builds on that ruin, and we just build ruin upon ruin as we go. And so we become a slave to our own passions, and we like to, when we talked about this earlier, we like to direct that on somebody else that's worse than us. But we become a slave to our own passions, and this is where we're like children. You can tell your kids not to ride in the back of the truck. They're going to still want to ride in the back of the truck. Their punishment is riding in the back of the truck. Okay? And so, like a child that you tell them, don't touch the stove, don't touch the stove, don't touch the stove, until they touch the stove, they learn not to touch the stove. And so, we as children of God need to look about our world and see somebody else touching the stove and learning from that we don't want to touch the stove. That's not something that we want to do, and change our attitude towards that. Because when the child touches the stove, that's the consequence. Obviously, they get burned. as we get closer to the fire, we get burned. And so it's part of our ignorance and our deflection onto, and it's a lot of that. We deflect to others. A lot of times what we don't like in ourselves, and a lot of times what like we said, we try to make ourselves better by making others worse. And so we wanted it, so God gave it to us. And that's one of those things. We wanted to ride in the back of the truck, and God let us. And obviously, one of the old terms, preaching to the choir, but a life without God is no life at all. A life without God is no life. Humanity without God is corrupt, and we know that. And that's the reason for his wrath. So no one has been, is, or ever will be free from that infection of corruption that has just laid waste to God's earth. Never has been, is, or ever will be free from that infection. And as we started in the second half of Romans, it's easy to assume that Paul is talking about the sins of idolatry and homosexuality all alone. I talked about this a little earlier. It's much broader than that, because it's not the lesser sins. We're not elevating these sins above other sins. I mean, in our minds we do, but Paul is not elevating these sins because they're not lesser sins. They're just other sins. Okay? They're just other sins. Go ahead, Mark.
In Leviticus, where God first gave the law for them to follow, everything laid out then. And it was a depravity, an abomination to God, which we held as the greater sin.
Right.
And it still is the same thing to God.
Right. It hasn't changed. Any sin being an abomination to God. And then we started grading sins, And I don't know if it's human nature. I don't know if it's just the way it is. But in a civilized society, we have laws. And if you break those laws, there's a punishment. But our society says the punishment for a bigger crime is more than a punishment for a little crime, okay? And so I think that's where we get our mindset from God or get our mindset that God has big sins and little sins, okay?
Some of those sins you had immediately, they were stoned, they were cut off from the people.
Absolutely. Throughout history and through early on in God's dealings with his people, it was immediate punishment, okay? It was, you're stoned, your family's stoned, your animals are killed, your tent is burned, as an example to keep purity in the camp and keep impurity out of the camp. And we learned about that as we were going through the Torah. And, I'm sorry? That's exactly right. It's a deterrent to repeat offenders, absolutely, because there will be no repeat if you're been stoned to death. So, and it's an example to others, okay? And obviously we feel like, oh, go ahead.
Don't we do that to our children, though?
Absolutely.
Don't we have what we punish them for more harshly than we do others?
That's why I said in our society it's easy to see, and we've just adopted that into God's interaction with his children as we do with our interaction with our children. And some of those things, they coincide. And there's times when kids know they can get away with something or think they know they can get away with something. That's where we live in society. That's where we are. We think we can get away with something. Okay?
John,
Yes, sir.
the verses that you're teaching now, it says, although they knew God, they did not honor him.
Exactly right.
It's always fascinated me how we can rationalize anything.
Rationalize and justify.
We can know a thing to be a fact, and in our mind, we can twist it any way we want.
Sure. If something is minuscule, and I'm not trying to minimize God's wrath or God's law, but how many people in this room drive the speed limit? Okay? Try to. Okay. Now, how many people in this room, they'll go 3 over? Just because that's a satisfactory number. 3 over is a satisfactory number. 5 over is a satisfactory number. No, I'm just saying. Okay? Now, with that, if we're going 5 over, and somebody blazes past us going 100, our minds say, I hope the police get that guy. Okay? Because I'm breaking the law, but he's breaking the law way worse than I'm breaking the law. Okay? And we do that same thing with sin. Okay? I talk about my neighbors, but my neighbor steals my cable. Or, so he's worse than I am because he's stealing, I'm just talking. Talking never hurt anybody. Okay? Okay? And it's down to obeying your parents is on the same scale of what we scale at. You're going to have to do way better at holding your hand up if you're way back there. Okay, there I see you.
You just noticed the homosexuality. The Bible says it is unrighteousness. Here, just in chapter 1, it is dishonorable, it's shameful. Usually what a Christian will say who is practicing homosexuality, as long as it's consensual and as long as it's not with an underage. That's not what Romans says. Any man that will lie with another man as he would with a woman, it is a shame. It is a vile sin. And he makes that clear. And it goes back to your idea that we worship the Creator. In other words, we worship ourselves. We define it. We've got to live in a world where certain states say it's legal.
And we're going to get to that. I think you have this same lesson plan. You printed it off for me. I know you have it somewhere. So, the condemnation of homosexuality is not just, and we're going to, I'll get to it right now, okay? Humanity gave up on the obvious truth of God, the Creator, and turned to honor the creation. Lusts and unnatural desires determined what was right and wrong. Okay? We got to decide for ourselves what was right and what was wrong. Idolatry is just a way of justifying corruption. Okay? Idolatry is a way of justifying corruption. Make a god of sex, and sexual immorality becomes a religious act or an expression of genuine love. Create a god of wine, and drunkenness becomes a way to achieve enlightenment, or simply a justifiable act ordained by the gods. Human beings place themselves on a pedestal and justify their actions based on shameful desires. They become their own god to replace the true God, the one true God. And so, we have a habit, even in this area, of trying to, And that's the thing. We try to circumvent the law. You know, we know what the law is, but if we can find that loophole, we're a loophole society. That's the loophole. Okay. There was and I call them the weed smoking church. There was a weed smoking church over here at Savoy that tried to get past the laws of, and our laws are getting more lax and more lax on that particular thing, but tried to get past the laws of drug use by calling it a religious act. Okay, so they tried to separate church and state, and they said, well, this is part of our religious process, and so we can smoke weed. Just not because of any of those things, it's just because they wanted to smoke weed. And so we do the same thing. Okay, we circumvent the law. We find what we would consider a loophole, because a God of love justifies my behavior, okay? Because I do this out of love. And so God is love, and I'm doing this out of love, so God justifies my behavior, and now I'm good with God. You know, me and God, we're good, okay? Not the case. And so idolatry, okay, these are and we got off topic, and I can't imagine how that happened, but God is there's the reason. We've all sinned and deserve God's wrath, so there's a reason for these specific two sins. Humanity has exchanged the truth of God as creator for a lie. Idolatry is the lie that humanity has substituted for true religion. Homosexuality is the lie that humanity has accepted as morally acceptable sexual behavior. Humanity has accepted as morally acceptable sexual behavior. And as Paul is, there are those out there, and Mike touched on it a little bit, that will say that Paul is just talking about rampant homosexuality. He's not talking about homosexuality within a monogamous relationship. He's not talking about homosexuality as it relates to religion. He's not talking. It's condemned in general. He does not regard these two as only sins that characterize rebellion. Disobeying one's parents, gossiping, speaking evil of others, being arrogant and boasting. These are unnatural because they're part of our fallen nature and are in opposition to what God created us to be. Okay? All of those things that we count as sin, all of those things that God counts as sin, are in opposition of what God created us to be. And we are God's creation. What we ought to be, not what we are. Okay? Nature and Scripture, going against nature, is going against what we ought to be, not what we are. God made us to serve Him and act in accordance to His will, not our sinful nature. And then he goes on to condemn not only those that commit that particular sin, but if you're condoning or approving of those particular lifestyles, there's condemnation for that also. Okay.
But I'm going to say the same thing, Johnny. What makes it so hard on us is when the law of the land demands we accept it.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
we will get in trouble when we don't accept this falsehood.
That's exactly right.
And it makes it hard.
It gets tougher and tougher. Okay. And there are extremes in both directions around the world as far as attempts to quell that type of behavior, attempts to uplift that type of behavior, and everything in between. But God not only holds us accountable for our actions, but also how we respond to the sin of others. Okay? And so we may not be homosexual, but we can't support homosexuality. Nor can we be greedy and justify the attitude in others. Charles, we need to cheat on our taxes. It's just how it goes. We need to cheat on our taxes. Everybody does it. Absolutely. Everybody goes 5 over or 3 over or whatever. I'm just trying to be safe because if I went the speed limit, everybody would run me down. Okay? Go ahead, Mike.
You deal with this Christmas Day. How do we feel about a child of God voting for any politician that says or agrees on things like same-sex marriage? How do we justify that within the Christian community?
Well, the Christian will justify it himself by he's not voting for that. He's voting against whatever this other person is for, or it's just one of those things we have to deal with in order to get what we want, and we'll justify it a lot that way too. The lesser of two evils. That's exactly right. And that's the way humanity works. That's those loopholes we were talking about earlier. So,
There's a progression in this whole thing.
absolutely.
In the beginning, in the homosexual community, for example, it's just, all we want is acceptance. I don't want to put this on you. Just leave me alone. Just accept it.
Yep.
But now it's developed into, you don't accept it.
Right.
You got a problem.
It went from acceptance, the homosexuality, homosexual in the community.
So that begs the question, how much further can it go?
That's exactly right. And we saw that, and that's what I was talking about, the fall of Rome. It can destroy a nation, okay? It can destroy a nation because it went from acceptance to tolerance to, a moral standard. And so that's how far we've gone. And the world around us is not slowing down. I can tell you that right now. And so God as creator gave us everything, and we ruined it. We suffer in the world we created by our own sinfulness. The problem of suffering in the world, it was created by us. And that's the issue we have to deal with because God's angry. And it's for all the right reasons. Okay? We decided we wanted to get in the back of that truck. Okay? We made that decision. And we in this room are sorry for that decision. We've turned from that decision, and we want to do what God would have us to do. We want to ride back up in the cab of that truck where it's dry and then we're not getting slaughtered by the raindrops, okay? And so as we go through Romans and we talk about these particular things, let's just remember what God wants for us, what we've done, and it's a we, what we've done as humanity to destroy God's perfect world, what we as humanity can do to get back to or move back towards what God would have us to do and who God would have us to be, and focus more on our disappointments, how we disappoint God, rather than continue to disappoint God, justifying it by somebody else disappoints God way more than I do. Okay? Let's do that. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm going to turn this off because I got to